The missile left the launcher at hypersonic speed. No warning, no diplomatic note, just a streak of fire cutting across the surface of the Philippine Sea, traveling faster than the speed of sound times 9, designed to pierce the hull of an aircraft carrier before any defense system on Earth can calculate a response. The People's Liberation Army Navy did not announce this test in advance. They simply released the footage afterward, timed with perfect precision to coincide with the single largest Allied military exercise the United States has ever conducted in the Western Pacific. The message was not subtle. It was not meant to be. On the exact same day that 17,000 troops from 7 nations were training on Philippine soil, China's aircraft carrier Liaoning was pushing through the Taiwan Strait and entering the South China Sea. Its strike group fanned out behind it like a war formation, not a peacetime patrol. And right now, as you are watching this, that carrier is still there. The clock is running, and this is where everything changes. To understand what is actually happening in the South China Sea right now, you cannot look at any single event in isolation. You have to zoom out and see the entire architecture of what has been building piece by piece, fleet by fleet, island by island, over the last several months. Because what happened at the end of April 2026 was not a coincidence. It was not routine. It was not a reaction. It was the opening move of something that defense analysts from Washington to Tokyo are describing as the most dangerous convergence of military forces in the Pacific since the Korean War. And the warships that just entered the South China Sea are only the most visible part of the story. Let us start with what Reuters, USNI News, and the South China Morning Post have all confirmed. On April 20th, the exact day that exercise Balikatan 2026 officially commenced at Camp General Emilio Aguinaldo in Manila, China's aircraft carrier Liaoning, designation CV-16, transited the Taiwan Strait and sailed directly into the South China Sea. At the same time, a separate People's Liberation Army Naval Task Group designated Task Force 107, led by the Type 055 cruiser Zunyi, was dispatched eastward through the Okawate Channel into the Philippine Sea, positioning itself directly off the eastern coast of Luzon, the northernmost major island of the Philippines. 2 separate fleets, moving in 2 separate directions, surrounding the Philippine archipelago from the west and the east simultaneously. Defense analysts describe this to USNI News as a tactical envelopment rehearsal. China practicing how to pressure U.S. and allied forces from 2 axes at once. But that is not even the most dangerous part. Balikatan 2026 is not just the biggest iteration of this exercise in its 41-year history. It is something categorically different from anything that came before it. More than 17,000 troops from the United States, the Philippines, Australia, Japan, Canada, France, and New Zealand are operating across the Philippine archipelago from April 20th through May 8th. An additional 17 nations are participating as observers. According to Stars and Stripes and confirmed by U.S. Marine Corps official statements, this year's drills feature maritime strike operations, coastal defense exercises, anti-submarine warfare training, live fire gunnery drills, and the simulated firing of BrahMos cruise missiles. Japan's self-defense forces are present not as observers but as full combat participants for the first time in the history of this exercise, and they came prepared, deploying Type 88 anti-ship cruise missiles, which they used to sink a decommissioned target vessel in waters north of Luzon, less than 1 hour's flight from the coast of Taiwan. That was not a symbolic gesture. That was Japan demonstrating, in real time with live weapons, that it can interdict the Bashi Channel, the critical maritime choke point between the Philippines and Taiwan, through which any Chinese naval assault on the island would have to pass. And here is where the geography matters enormously. Itbayat Island, the northernmost point of the Philippines, sits 155 kilometers from the coast of Taiwan. During Balikatan 2026, the United States deployed the Typhoon mid-range missile system, which carries Tomahawk cruise missiles with a range exceeding 1,600 kilometers, to Cagayan North International Airport on Luzon. The U.S. Navy Marine Expeditionary Ship Interdiction System, known as NMESIS, and its anti-ship naval strike missiles were positioned on the island of Itbayat itself. According to USNI News, an area of the Luzon Strait was declared a no-sail zone specifically to accommodate special operations-led anti-ship drills. What Washington and Manila have effectively done is turn the northern Philippine Islands into a precision strike lattice pointing directly at the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea simultaneously. Every ship Beijing sends through those waters now does so within range of multiple Allied missile systems deployed on land that cannot be sunk. Beijing understood exactly what this meant. The PLA's Southern Theater Command issued a statement describing its own counter-operations as a necessary action taken in response to the current regional situation. That phrase, used with deliberate bureaucratic coldness, was China's way of saying, "You moved your pieces, now watch us move ours." The Liaoning strike group, according to analysts cited in The Diplomat, includes multiple destroyers, frigates, support ships, amphibious elements, and at least one additional Type 055 guided missile destroyer alongside the Zunyi. A Type 075 amphibious assault ship, China's equivalent of a small helicopter carrier capable of projecting Marines onto contested beaches, was also confirmed deployed into the South China Sea at the same time. And then came the missiles. The PLA's official social media channel, China Military Bugle, released footage of YJ-20 hypersonic anti-ship missiles being launched from the Type D-55 at sea, the exact category of weapon designed to overwhelm the layered air defenses of an American carrier strike group. Defense security. Asia noted that if verified, a YJ-20 launch near the Philippines during concurrent Balikatan operations would represent something unprecedented, a direct, real-time demonstration of maritime denial capability targeting high-value naval assets, delivered at the precise moment an American-led coalition was rehearsing war scenarios in those same waters. What happened next shocked even seasoned defense observers. On April 17th, 3 days before Balikatan began, the Japanese destroyer J.S. Akazuchi transited the Taiwan Strait. It was only the fourth time a Japanese warship had made that transit since September 2024, and the first since Japan's new Prime Minister Takaichi Sanai took office. April 17th is also the anniversary of the 1895 Treaty of Shimonoseki, under which a defeated China was forced to cede Taiwan to Japan following the First Sino-Japanese War. Beijing did not miss the symbolism. The PLA Daily accused Tokyo of harming the feelings of the Chinese people by choosing that specific date, and China responded by simultaneously launching naval exercises in the East China Sea and dispatching the 133rd Naval Task Group westward through the Ryukyu island chain. Russian naval vessels were spotted making the same transit in the opposite direction on April 21st and 22nd, according to Japan's Joint Staff Office, including the submarine RFS Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky sailing through the waters south of Yonaguni Island. Moscow and Beijing were not coordinating operations in any formal sense, but the optics of Russian and Chinese warships crisscrossing the same maritime corridors simultaneously during the largest Allied exercise in Philippine history are impossible to ignore. But step back further, because there is a layer to this story that most coverage has not fully connected. The Balikatan exercise is unfolding against the backdrop of what Rappler described in Manila as another global issue casting its long shadow over the month-long drills. The ongoing U.S. military confrontation with Iran, and the resulting oil crisis rippling through global markets. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, which had previously been positioned in the Western Pacific, was repositioned to the Middle East as the Iran situation escalated, according to Newsweek. That temporary gap in U.S. carrier presence in the South China Sea did not go unnoticed in Beijing. The PLA's counter-operations during Balikatan are partly an attempt to exploit that window of reduced American carrier power in the region, signaling that when Washington divides its attention between two theaters, China will expand its operational footprint. It is a lesson Xi Jinping's military planners have been studying since Russia's invasion of Ukraine absorbed American strategic bandwidth in 2022. The question analysts are asking right now is whether the United States has the capacity to maintain credible deterrence in both the Middle East and the South China Sea at the same time, and whether Beijing has made a calculated assessment that the answer is no. Here is what the numbers tell us. China now operates the world's largest navy by hull count. By the PLA Navy's own estimates, confirmed by Pentagon reporting, Beijing fields more than 370 warships and submarines, including 3 aircraft carriers. The Type 055 destroyer, the vessel currently leading Task Force 107 in these operations, is among the most capable surface combatants afloat anywhere in the world, displacing 13,000 tons, armed with 112 vertical launch cells capable of firing a mix of anti-ship, land attack, anti-submarine, and surface-to-air missiles. In December 2025, satellite imagery analyzed and reported by Newsweek confirmed that China had begun dredging and land reclamation operations at Antelope Island in the Paracels, adding yet another potential forward operating base to an archipelago of militarized reefs and artificial islands China has constructed across the South China Sea since 2014. That island network now represents a permanent strategic depth that did not exist a decade ago. A string of unsinkable aircraft carriers, as one American admiral famously described them, pointing east toward the Philippine Islands and south toward the Malacca Strait, through which more than 30% of global maritime trade passes every single day. IMF estimates and Bloomberg shipping data consistently show that roughly $5 trillion in trade transits the South China Sea annually. The Strait of Malacca alone handles 40% of world trade by volume. Taiwan accounts for more than 60% of global advanced semiconductor manufacturing capacity. If China were to establish effective maritime control over the South China Sea, it would not simply be a territorial gain. It would be a stranglehold on the arteries of the global economy. That is why the warships that entered the South China Sea this week are not just about islands and reefs and historical claims. They are about who controls the future of global commerce, technology supply chains, and ultimately the balance of power in the 21st century. Washington has been watching Beijing's moves with cold clarity. The U.S. Philippine Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement now gives American forces rotational access to 9 designated military sites across the Philippines, and the $82 million in infrastructure upgrades funded by Washington at bases including Basa Air Base is quietly transforming the Philippine archipelago into a forward operating hub for Allied power projection. The Typhoon missile system, which was first deployed to the Philippines in 2024 and is now present again during Balikatan 2026, gives the United States the ability to strike targets deep inside the Chinese coast or across the South China Sea from land-based launchers that are effectively immune to the anti-ship missiles Beijing has invested so heavily in developing. China cannot sink a jungle. It cannot torpedo a mountain. And right now, American precision strike systems are nested inside both. At the exact same time that these military maneuvers are playing out, there is a diplomatic dimension that adds an entirely different layer of urgency to what is happening. According to The Diplomat, China's naval demonstrations during Balikatan 2026 are being interpreted by analysts not just as a response to the exercise itself, but as a calculated calibration of Beijing's posture ahead of a potential meeting between President Donald Trump and President Xi Jinping. For China, entering high-level diplomacy from a position of perceived military weakness, with Allied missile systems ringing its maritime periphery and Japan operating combat assets in the South China Sea for the first time since World War II, is politically and strategically unacceptable. The Liaoning's transit of the Taiwan Strait and the activation of Task Force 107 are Beijing's way of walking into the room with a demonstration of what it can do, making clear that any negotiated arrangement in the Indo-Pacific must account for Chinese military capability, not just Chinese diplomatic preferences. And the Philippines is no longer the passive middle ground it once appeared to be. Under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., Manila has signed reciprocal access agreements with Japan, which entered into force last September, as well as similar agreements with New Zealand, Canada, and most recently France. The Philippines has committed to a $35 billion military modernization campaign and recently purchased BrahMos supersonic cruise missiles from India, the same weapons being simulated in Balikatan 2026 strikes. According to The Diplomat, Japanese radar systems provided to the Philippines are now being integrated into joint air and maritime defense operations. What this means in practical terms is that Manila is no longer relying on Washington alone as its security guarantor. It is weaving itself into a web of bilateral defense agreements that collectively create an allied presence in the South China Sea that Beijing cannot easily isolate, intimidate, or neutralize one country at a time. The near collisions and confrontations that preceded all of this are important context. In late March 2026, the Philippine Navy's BRP Benguet was forced to take emergency evasive action after a PLA Navy Jiangkai II frigate executed what Philippine Rear Admiral Roy Vincent Trinidad described as a coercive and aggressive maneuver. He told reporters it was the first warship-to-warship confrontation in the area in some time and called it an escalation. Days before that, a Philippine Coast Guard aircraft carrying journalists was warned off by PLA Navy ships near Scarborough Shoal. These are not accidents. They are calibrated pressure, Chinese gray zone operations designed to normalize PLA control over contested waters through repeated, incremental acts of coercion that fall just below the threshold required to trigger a formal invocation of the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty. But that threshold is becoming harder to manage as platforms on both sides get closer together. Defense analysts, quoted by Defense Security Asia, have highlighted that under the clarifications Washington has repeatedly issued, Article 5 of the Mutual Defense Treaty now explicitly covers attacks on Philippine armed forces, public vessels, and aircraft anywhere in the South China Sea, including inside contested zones. That means any confrontation between PLA assets and Philippine naval vessels, regardless of location, carries the potential to activate a treaty that requires the United States to respond. And with 17,000 Allied troops currently operating on Philippine soil, with American missile systems deployed on Philippine islands, and with the Liaoning carrier group operating in the same waters, the margin for a mistake that triggers an escalation nobody planned for is narrower right now than it has been at any point in the last decade. Beijing is watching all of this with a mixture of strategic calculation and genuine anxiety that its own propaganda machine works very hard to conceal. The PLA's public messaging, carried through the Southern Theater Command's official statements and amplified by state media, projects absolute confidence and disciplined resolve. But the strategic picture is more complicated. China's economy is under significant pressure. Bloomberg and the Financial Times have documented the ongoing deflationary headwinds, the real estate sector crisis that has still not been fully resolved, the export disruptions caused by the tariff environment, and the demographic drag that will increasingly weigh on Chinese economic output through this decade. Xi Jinping needs a foreign policy narrative of strength to compensate for domestic economic disappointments. These naval demonstrations in the South China Sea serve that domestic political function as much as they serve any operational military purpose. But there is a danger in using real warships to send political messages, which is that real warships can be in the wrong place at the wrong time when a real incident occurs. Japan's transformation from observer to combat participant in these exercises is perhaps the single most consequential geopolitical shift that China did not fully anticipate. For decades, Japan's constitutional constraints and its own historical legacy shaped a posture of strict military restraint. The image of Japanese troops firing anti-ship missiles off the coast of a Philippine island that sits less than 2 hours from the coast of Taiwan, on a trajectory pointing directly at the waterway through which China would have to move its navy in any Taiwan contingency, is something Chinese strategic planners trained their entire careers never expecting to see. The PLA Daily can call it a return of militarism all at once. The operational reality is that Japan's Type 88 cruise missiles, India's BrahMos missiles on Philippine frigates, American Tomahawks positioned on Luzon, Australian P-8 surveillance aircraft overhead, and French Navy vessels sailing formation in the Palawan Passage together represent a combined maritime strike architecture that did not exist 3 years ago and has emerged almost entirely in response to Chinese pressure. The Scarborough Shoal question has not gone away either. China seized the shoal from the Philippines in 2012 and has maintained control ever since, but Manila has never stopped pressing its legal claim. The 2016 arbitral tribunal ruling of the Permanent Court of Arbitration found China's sweeping 9-line claim to roughly 90% of the South China Sea to be invalid under international law. Beijing has rejected that ruling as null and void. The Philippines invoked it again at bilateral talks in late March 2026. China's response was to conduct combat readiness patrols around Scarborough Shoal the very next day, releasing video footage of warships and jets circling the disputed feature in a display of defiance that was as much directed at Washington as it was at Manila. According to the Washington Times, the Philippine Defense Ministry issued a statement on March 16th, formally rejecting China's claim to the shoal and insisting it is Philippine sovereign territory. That kind of direct public legal confrontation over a specific piece of geography, while simultaneously conducting live-fire allied exercises nearby, is a combination that raises the operational stakes to a level that demands careful management by every party involved. What is happening in the South China Sea right now is therefore not a single event. It is the convergence of multiple accelerating trends arriving at the same moment. The largest allied military exercise in Philippine history running through May 8th. A Chinese carrier strike group in the South China Sea. A Chinese task force in the Philippine Sea, Russian naval vessels transiting Japan's southwest island chain. PLA hypersonic missiles test-fired in the same waters where Allied ships are conducting exercises. American Typhoon launchers on Philippine soil. Japanese combat troops firing anti-ship weapons off Luzon for the first time since 1945. A potential Trump-Xi summit on the horizon. An ongoing U.S. military confrontation with Iran bleeding American strategic resources from the Pacific. A Philippine government that has chosen, with clarity and commitment, to stand with the United States and its allies, and is legally, politically, and now militarily integrating itself into a multilateral defense network China cannot easily dismantle. The alliance web being assembled is real. The deterrence math is not theoretical. Every day that Allied troops train together, every missile system integration test that succeeds, every anti-submarine warfare drill that tightens the kill chain, every Japanese radar unit handed to a Philippine commander, narrows the window in which Beijing could contemplate a gray zone escalation without facing consequences its military has never faced before. According to defense analysts quoted in USNI News, the deployment of Chinese warships to the Philippine Sea during Balikatan specifically gives Beijing a counter-intervention capability against American reinforcement routes from Guam and the broader Pacific. What that language describes, stripped of its analytical distance, is China rehearsing how to cut off American reinforcements to the Philippines in a war scenario. That is not a training exercise, that is war planning. Balikatan ends on May 8th. When it does, the 17,000 troops will begin to disperse, the warships will return to their home ports, and the missile systems will be secured at their designated Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites. But the Liaoning will still be out there. Task Force 107 will still be out there. The YJ-20 footage will still be on the internet, playing on a loop through every defense ministry in the Indo-Pacific. The Scarborough Shoal will still be under Chinese control. The artificial islands and the Spratly chain will still be bristling with runways, radar installations, and missile batteries. And Taiwan will still be 155 kilometers from Itbayat Island, waiting to see what the next chapter looks like. The question that no one in Washington, Manila, Tokyo, or Beijing can answer with certainty right now is what happens when the exercises end, but the pressure does not. What happens the next time a PLA frigate executes an aggressive maneuver against a Philippine landing ship in contested waters? What happens if a Philippine sailor is killed? What happens if Beijing decides, having seen Allied missile systems on Luzon and Japanese anti-ship missiles pointed at the Bashi Channel, that the window for consolidating control over the South China Sea is closing faster than it thought, and that waiting carries more risk than acting? The Mutual Defense Treaty has never been tested. Article 5 has never been invoked. No one actually knows what the response looks like in real time, with real ships, real missiles, and real people making decisions in minutes, not months. The warships that entered the South China Sea this week changed the geometry of everything. They changed it by demonstrating that the United States and its allies can and will project combined military power into China's claimed waters at a scale Beijing cannot ignore. They changed it by showing that Japan is willing to fire live weapons in those waters, that France is willing to sail there, that New Zealand and Canada are willing to stand alongside the Philippines in a contest that most of them have no direct territorial claim in, but all of them have an enormous strategic stake in. And they changed it by forcing Beijing to respond, not with restraint, not with diplomacy, but with a carrier and a task force and a hypersonic missile test that the whole world is now watching. The clock on the Balikatan exercise is running down. May 8th is 1 week away. The Liaoning is still in the South China Sea. The Trump-Xi summit is on the horizon. And somewhere in the Philippine Sea, Task Force 107 is running live fire drills in waters that will have to be crossed by any force that wants to decide what happens next in this part of the world. Every admiral on every side of this confrontation is looking at the same map right now and asking the same question.